Welcome to the Old-Fashioned Masonic Podcast, where we talk all things Freemasons, while drinking an old-fashioned. If you're not already a subscriber, please hit that subscribe button now. Platforms other than YouTube tend to block some of our content. Subscribe now to get up-to-date videos and shorts as they release. Now, enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Old-Fashioned Masonic Podcast, where we talk all things Freemasonry while drinking an old-fashioned. I'm Brian.
And I'm Russ. I'm Dave.
So, Dave, if Dave Thomas is on, we're talking something with history. So, considering a couple of days ago was the infamous Friday the 13th, we want to talk to you. Don't freak out. Don't turn off. Like, why are these knuckleheads? This is supposed to be a Masonic channel. Why are they talking about Friday the 13th and Halloween? Has nothing to do with Halloween. Most people associate Friday the 13th with Black Cats, Crystal Lake, and Jason Voorhees, but we're not going to talk about any of that today. But this infamous day comes around twice a year, right? There's usually two Friday the 13th a year.
I actually didn't know Jason had a last name.
Jason Voorhees?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Did you know Crystal Lake?
No.
Oh, well, I got it. Russ, I expect a little bit more about you. So what we're going to talk about...
There, you should come visit.
All right, well...
There's a Crystal Lake in the area where we live now that's a housing development called The Moorings. It's on Crystal Lake. Did you know that?
I did not.
It's a fun fact. Fact. Google it, folks. So what we're going to talk about is something that started 716 years ago. So brothers, Masonically, there's your clue. Do you know what the significance is with the number 716?
No, not off the top of my head.
Because there is none. I was just wanting to make sure that we kept you on your toes, so I had them prepped slightly before the start of this. This is going to be interesting because I can always tell before we start a shoot where Russ's vibe's going to be, how much I'm going to poke and prod him a little bit. So he's like here today. He was yawning earlier, but I digress. So if you think your Friday the 13th was bad, you should be very happy that you're not a 14th century Knights Templar. So on October 13th, 1307,
that was a bad day.
That was a bad day. That was the start of a really bad few years for some folks, right?
Yeah.
So lots of tease alerts. So the officers of King Philip IV of France raided thousands of homes of these Crusade warriors, imprisoning them on a lot of charges of illegal activities. There was a little bit more that we're going to talk about. Though these charges weren't proven, more than hundreds died. They had terrible tortures. And you can find out more of this in the book, The Tales of the Knights Templar. It's a Warner Books product that was produced in 1995. So check that out in the description. So let's kind of go back to the Knights Templar. On January 13th, 1128, Pope, what are we going with?
Honorius,
Honorius II, grants a papal sanction. Papal sanction. See, this is like hooked on phonics for me. This is challenging. You know, I went to public schools, folks, so stay with me. Granted the sanction of this military order known as the Knights Templar, declaring them as an army of God. So they had a purpose, right? Their purpose was to protect Christian pilgrims on their way to and from the Holy Lands during the Crusades. This was initially led by a Frenchman, Hugh de Payens.
Go with Payens, yeah.
Payens, and this was founded in 1118. They were essentially the special forces of their time. These were some bad boys. Not many people could hang with them, and they could fight. So in the beginning, the Templars only had 9 members, mostly due to their very rigid rules, and one of them was celibacy.
I think there were roughly 80-some rules that they had to follow that were just...
Right. Well, I'm out on the first one, so that's just me. So fast forward. You're telling me you're in?
Yeah, no, I'm not in.
Okay, all right. So 1127, there were some new promotional efforts to convince some noble men to join the order. So I'm not quite sure what that what that was. I don't think there were billboards around with the old Uncle Sam back in the day.
It all comes down to dollars and cents.
It doesn't it?
Yeah.
And we are going to talk about the dollar bill, y'all. So a little bit later in this conversation. So fast forward. Again, these were some bad boys. They did exactly what their goal was intended to do, right? They were praised for their efforts by the Catholic Church. Fun fact for me, I didn't know that the Knights Templar were Catholic, but Russ quickly said, well,
They were Christian.
Right.
There were no other Christians at
there were
the time.
none.
Right.
So
That's why they're the history guys and I'm not, right? So by the time the Crusades had ended in the early 14th century, the Knights had become just unbelievably wealthy. And just like in today's time, when there's a lot of wealth, there's a lot of jealousy, right? And the jealousy came from both the religious and secular powers. So this was a real issue for the Knights, okay?
Right.
So in addition just to being unbelievable warriors, they were really good bankers. So let's think about this. Dudes, ego, dudes, money. We're starting to tell the story, right? So the Knights had developed a system that was highly effective and very efficient for that time period. In fact, they were the inventors of the check system back in the day. So essentially, folks could deposit their wealth into one castle, take it across the country or the world, and with proper documentation, get money from another castle. And Russ earlier, he's like, well, that was just a letter of credit.
yeah.
Essentially a letter of credit.
It was basically the invention of deposit accounts, right? You would take all of your wealth to one castle, as you said, and you could, with the proper documentation, you could go to another castle in the Middle East, specifically in this case, to retain your wealth, to get your wealth back. This goes back to a time when, so the invention of gold jewelry, being able to wear gold jewelry goes back thousands of years before that, where you wore your wealth on you. It wasn't to be ornate. Right. It wasn't to be ostentatious. It was because you couldn't trust other people not to steal your stuff while you weren't at home. So you wore your wealth with you and often covered up, right?
Right.
But when you traveled, you had to travel with your wealth. You couldn't just leave it at home in a safe.
Which made you vulnerable.
Which made you very vulnerable. And it was very onerous for the Knights Templar, who were tasked with protecting the pilgrims from Europe to the Middle East, because they couldn't protect everybody, right? And you were a huge target, carrying all your wealth with you from one place to another. And these bandits didn't just come and steal your wealth. They typically murdered you and all of your family, and probably did more unspeakable things than just killing.
Because it wasn't just the Crusaders and groups going down to the Holy Land to fight. It was truly a holy pilgrimage for some. And so, they needed protection.
Right.
Yeah.
And they needed a banking system too.
This was an invention by the Templars to do just that, was to circumvent that gap where people had to go with their wealth, and it made the Templars' job easier. And you talk about how wealthy they got. We didn't mention that in the beginning they were known as the Poor Knights. That was kind of their nickname. In fact, their logo,
because they were destitute.
They were. They relied completely on charity from the church, charity from individuals. Their logo was two knights on one horse, because ostensibly they couldn't afford a horse for each knight. So it definitely benefited them as a brotherhood to invent this system. I don't think that was the intent in the beginning. I think the intent was to actually protect people, but it turned them into the wealthiest people on the planet at that time.
Well, do the first toast of the podcast. Toast to being able to wear our jewelry in public for the most part without being jacked, unless we go to Chicago. I was trying to get you in mid-sip there.
Well done.
So now we're kind of talking about the banking system and how much money. This is where the big target became. It wasn't that they were badass warriors. It was that they had started to gather all of this wealth, and because they had lived a life of being destitute, they weren't balling out. It wasn't this lottery mentality. They were building these assets and this wealth. And you could argue if it was being used for good or not, but they weren't out just wasting it. So all of this wealth scared the king and the church because they were operating with that money better, and it was more than anything, it was a threat to his power. And in addition to the operations and this wealth, the king owed him money.
Yeah, the king had huge amounts of debt too.
Massive debt. And not just the king, but France itself.
Yeah.
And to everyone, or?
Basically, yes. So the Knights Templar at the time can be seen as the Federal Reserve today.
Okay.
They helped to finance much of the country. In fact, it's said that a third of France's finances went through the Knights Templar at that point. This is 200 years into the Knights Templar, right? So they were around for a couple of centuries. But at that point, yes, they were easily the wealthiest group or fraternity on the planet. And all of that wealth was being financed through them for France. And so, yeah, huge national debt and personal debt from the king. He needed to find a way to absolve himself of it, and I'll let you get to the rest.
Nice. Well, speaking of the Federal Reserve, I was at some meetings this week. True story. The former president of the Dallas Fed had a meeting with him, Kaplan, and your 10-year treasuries are probably going to stay around 4.25 to 4.29 to the end of 2024. So do what you want with that, and maybe look for natural resources for the next 18 months. As I digress, so the king needed more money for upcoming wars and funds. So in 1307, King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V, Pope Clement V, combined to take down the powers of the Knights Templar. So let's just kind of talk about what their trap was. So Jacques de Molay was in France to be the pallbearer for the king's sister-in-law, Catherine of Courtenay. So while they were there for that funeral, and Jacques de Molay was a pallbearer, you think if you come to a funeral, it's sacred ground. Him and many of his knights were captured, and the torture started then. That's Friday, October the 13th, 1307. This trial went on for 7 years. They had confessions, and they recanted the confessions, but this went off and on again for 7 years.
And that's, before we, get into the next part of that, that's part of where Friday the 13th began, as far as a superstition, because imagine at the time, the Templars were superheroes to a lot of people.
They were.
I mean, people, peasants, people with absolutely no wealth would leave whatever they had to the Templars after they died.
So they could continue on their fight. They thought they were funding a good cause.
They had that kind of veneration.
Right.
They were seen as the heroes of the time. And so the news, when it spread on Friday the 13th, that all the Templars were being arrested, it was a day that was remembered. And so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and that's going to segue into a little bit later about these different days. So this trial throughout the lands was it was known to be wrapped in deceit, terror, bribery. Some of the knights' attorneys, they kept resigning, due to fear of persecution. They just knew this was bogus, right? But they were afraid to argue with the king, or even the Pope at the time. They just did not want that smoke. So again, they went back. These tortures were unbelievable. I mean, they were burning them, maiming them. And so under duress, everyone thinks, well, I'm not going to admit to anything under torture. Well, you've never been to seer school, so let's just talk about that. So even claiming their innocence, they kind of go back and forth, and there's just a lot of beating and torturing. So they said what they wanted, but after 7 years, they'd kind of gone back and forth, and they got in front of the group, showed their mutilated bodies, and said, hey, can we have at least a fair trial? All of these confessions they were under duress. Can you imagine people trying to do that today? I mean, you can get a confession thrown out of court if you don't have an attorney with you, for you. So all of this infuriated the king. And fast forward, he ended up burning Jacques de Molay and others at the stake on March 18th, 1314. So here's kind of the interesting thing. So after nearly 7 years of just an unbearable time, I can't imagine how awful that would be, right? Jacques de Molay, while being burned at the stake, demanded a fair trial before God. He's yelling at the king, yelling at the Pope, and I want a fair trial before God. So he said out loud, which is memorialized to the king and the Pope, "Not a year will pass before we meet again." Both the king and the Pope died within that year. And that this is later has been dubbed as the curse of Jacques de Molay. So, Russ, talk to us about the king and the Pope.
Yeah, so the king died of basically a hemorrhage, a cerebral hemorrhage or whatnot.
No blunt force trauma, right? They say it was natural.
Yeah, that while he was out hunting. So the other was what I told you earlier wasn't true. So I'm not finding exactly why he died. He just died within the year.
He died within that year's. So there are rumors out there. Was he poisoned? Was he not? So we want to try to be careful that if we're talking about something, we can at least source it.
But regardless, both did die within a year. Just like I mentioned before the show, I always thought this was a myth. But during my research, I couldn't find where it wasn't true. Like every source that I saw, it's true. They died within a year. He said they would die within a year. I'm not one to believe in superstitions, but that's pretty impressive.
Yeah. So there is a rumor that both of them crossed the path of a black cat. So that's not true either.
Okay. Thanks.
There we go.
So
going back to your first, that this has nothing to do with cats and Halloween. And then
this is an April
Fool's.
Fool's.
Throw it in. Yeah.
Part of the issue with the trial was some of those accusations were based on reality. One of the things was that they were supposed to spit on the cross. The Templars were supposed to spit on the cross and denounce Christ during the last initiation. And that may have been partially true because just like some of our special forces today, they were trained on what will happen if they are captured by the Muslims, what they are to do and what they are to expect. So part of that was in their training and their initiation.
It was bastardized and taken out of context.
Exactly.
Right.
It wasn't actually a denunciation. Is that a word?
Yeah.
They weren't actually denouncing Christ. So.
Right. So kind of fast forward. The modern-day Catholic Church has since admitted that the persecution of the Knights Templar was unjustified and claimed that Pope Clement was actually under pressure by some secular rulers to dissolve the order. Now, so let's kind of take that into modern day. Let's just say this was a king, or there are places with kings. A king where there's actual real law. So let's say there's a king and he had some special forces people murdered, and then it ended up being unjust, and he's like, well, I was getting pressure from the other kings in the region. Would they not light this guy up? I mean, baby Jesus solved the problem and took them both out in the year, right? So, but it's awful, right? I mean, it's just, that to me, that is a piss poor excuse.
So, at the time, the Catholic Church was the church.
He's the Pope.
And
The only church, right.
And the only church. And so, all of the kings basically, they were not going to go against the Catholic Church. And then, oh, by the way, they might have owed the Templars some money as well.
I think
it might have been.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, and
we liked them, but
I think it was a shakedown that failed.
I don't know that it failed.
No, I don't think it.
Well,
I think it
fair.
completely.
It wasn't as easy as they thought it might be.
Fair. So they 100% succeeded in what they wanted, and that was that all of the Templar wealth went to the countries of the designated castles, right? So
if it had succeeded, we wouldn't have National Treasure, the movie.
That's true. That's true. Or modern day masonry in 17. Now, know that this was about 400 years before masonry as we know it.
Yeah.
That started in England in 1717. So.
Sorry, and I interrupted.
Oh, yeah, and thank you, because I just remembered what I was about to say. Part of it was the Crusades had failed.
Yeah.
Right? And so the Crusades were basically over. De Molay wanted to go back to the Middle East and kind of take it over, partially maybe because he believed in the cause, but also because he kind of knew that without the Crusades, there was no purpose left for the Templars other than the money machine that they had become.
Right.
And so...
Because the last Christian stronghold, Acre, in 1298, 99...
It had been lost for decades.
Yeah.
So...
Right. And so they didn't really have a point to their existence anymore. And so it was a natural fear that they were about to go under, and they did.
And the money didn't motivate them. Helping their fellow man really was their purpose. I mean, the money wasn't...
Ostensibly, that's, of course, what they put out, and I believe a lot of them believed that.
Right.
Were devoted to that. But I'm sure that there were some... just human nature. Right?
Sure.
Anywhere in there, you would see some of that. But... without having a purpose and with having all those funds available, it was natural for all of the world's leadership to look at them with an envious eye.
Fair. There we go. So we've tied in Jacques de Molay, a French king, a pope, and Jason Voorhees all into one episode. It's complete, gentlemen. Thanks for watching Old Fashioned Masonic Podcast.
Enjoy.
Cheers.
What did you think of this episode? To continue to promote Freemasonry, hit that like button now. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button and give us a comment. The Old Fashioned Masonic Podcast, where real Masons talk Freemasonry. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and give us a comment.